Okay, and we are recording. Oh, participants are coming up. Awesome. Hi, everybody, and welcome to our webinar today. I'm your host, Heather Creamer with MedeXN, and today we're featuring Dr. Sheri Colberg, who's going to share some of her wisdom with us on training clients with diabetes or prediabetes. So before we begin, I'm just going to let everybody know that we are everybody coming on is on mute. And we do have a chat box in the bottom. So if you do have a question or a comment as we're going through the presentation, put them in the chat box. We will have time at the end of the presentation, and Dr. Colberg will be answering the questions. And I think that's it. We're just going to give a few minutes for everybody to jump on. So I'm in Nova Scotia. And Dr. Colberg, I know you're all the way on the other coast in California. So yes, maybe some people hop on the chat box and let us know where you're from. So wherever you're from, put it in the chat box. Oh, from Halifax, awesome. Toronto, Fall River. Hi, Shelley. Hi, Danielle. Krista. Wow. Good representation. I think some of my peeps from the Nova Scotia Fitness Association are coming on board today. Awesome. Toronto, Ontario. Looks like Maryland. Oh, got some representation from the US as well. Sheri, awesome. Great. Okay, and can everybody hear me okay? Just stick it in the chat box. Yes, I can hear you. Awesome. Thank you very much. Wonderful. Okay, so I'm going to take my video off and I'm going to introduce Dr. Colberg and we're going to get started. Okay. All right. So Dr. Colberg, I mean, she has a CV that's probably 72 pages long, so I'm going to keep it a little shorter, but we are really, really excited to have her here today. Dr. Sheri Colberg is an exercise physiologist, a lecturer, and professor emerita of exercise science. She is the author of over 400 articles on exercise, diabetes, and health, as well as numerous books, including The Diabetes-Free Kids, The 7-Step Diabetes Fitness Plan, Diabetes and Keeping Fit for Dummies, and her most recent book, which is The Athlete's Guide to Diabetes. She does regularly consult for the American Diabetes Association and the Juvenile Diabetes Research Foundation, as well as working closely with the American College of Sports Medicine and the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics on diabetes-related topics and projects. And she was recently honored with the American Diabetes Association Outstanding Educator in Diabetes Award. So we are so lucky to have her here. She's conducted numerous studies and is also sought out by researchers from around the world to provide her expertise. And we are so excited to let you know that she's also the author of MedeXN's Canadian Edition Diabetes Exercise Programs, which includes all 3 levels of courses for working with clients with diabetes or prediabetes, and also our Diabetes Exercise Specialist, DES Advanced Qualification. And I should mention that all these courses are also recognized for continuing ed. Dr. Colberg also has type 1 diabetes, so she does have firsthand experience of exercising with diabetes. And with that, I am going to welcome Dr. Colberg and thank you for presenting today.
Thank you. I'm so glad to be here with everybody. I just wish I could see everyone. It'll be nice to get back to that sometime in the future.
Absolutely.
So in addition to having lived with type 1 diabetes myself for over 50 years, my grandmother had type 2 diabetes, and I remember working with her when I was a young teenager and helping her on her quest to lose weight. When I was visiting one summer, she was always on a diet anyway, but I remember I made a deal with her that I was going to help her lose weight that while I was there, and she was going to pay me $1 US for every pound that she lost. And the way that dieting goes, I mean, I had her running laps around the backyard, and I was helping her weigh out her food and measure and check her weight daily and everything. And wouldn't you know it, in the first week, she lost 8 pounds, which is a lot, and not unexpected when you just restrict your calorie intake and start doing more things. What you really want to do is have sustainable weight loss, which is not just that water weight initially, but so I can answer questions on all varieties of, it doesn't have to just be type 1 or type 2 or prediabetes. I'm actually quite knowledgeable on all of those. So let's go ahead and get started. So you probably are wondering if your particular clients have diabetes or prediabetes, if you weren't aware of that. And I would say, yes, it's likely when we throw in prediabetes with diabetes, it's over 1 in 3 Canadians. So that ends up being a lot of people. And it's very likely that somebody you're working with does have one of those 2 conditions. So let's talk a little bit about what it means when they have those and how that might impact their ability to be active. So just starting with some basics, I'm assuming some people know this and some people don't, but what we always call blood sugar is actually blood glucose. And a number of years ago, it got debated at the American Diabetes Association. So we call this blood glucose or blood sugar. And because there's so many different sugars out there, and there was misconception that just eating sugar gives you diabetes, which is not really true. So a lot of times I use blood glucose because it's very specific to the type of sugar, the simple sugar that's in blood. So most of what ends up, how it gets there is from the carbohydrates that you eat, but basically some of the foods can be converted into carbohydrates or simple sugars as well. So some of the glucose may come from protein and also from fat compounds. So, and also because it's so important for your body to maintain a certain blood glucose at all times, because your brain it uses the glucose for its main fuel. So does your nervous system. So when we talk about what happens when it gets too low, you have certain symptoms that are related to your brain and your nervous system. But it's also produced by your liver, and your liver is kind of the critical organ that can both store glucose and release it in order to help maintain that at a certain level all the time. And just to let you know how important it is, that we have 5 different hormones, including glucagon and adrenaline, that raise blood glucose, whereas we typically only have one way to lower it, and that's what I'm going to talk about now. So insulin is the only hormone we have that actually lowers it. And that tells you that it's not equal in terms of the body thinks it's more important to boost the glucose up than it is to worry about keeping it lower. And that sort of ended up being a problem now that we're more civilized and we have constant access to food and we maybe don't move around as much. So it would be nice if we had more than one way to lower it, not just insulin. But the pancreas makes there are certain cells in the pancreas that make and release insulin, and those are the beta cells. But we also have one of those glucose raising hormones that comes from the alpha cells in the pancreas, so glucagon. So we have, the pancreas has quite a role as well as the liver in maintaining a normal metabolism. So what happens to actually get us to the point where we have diabetes? And I'm going to talk specifically about those 3 types a little bit, and not so much about gestational, what occurs during pregnancy. So what is type 1? This is actually more rare than type 2. And you can see that globally, that's maybe 5 to 10%. It's probably the same in Canada and the United States. And what is believed to happen is a loss of those beta cells, that they're attacked by your body's own self and removes those through an autoimmune process that involves a number of different immune cells, which is interesting because now, at least the American Diabetes Association, I think others have followed suit, actually categorizes type 1 diabetes not just as when you have onset of high blood glucose, but they actually have stages that have to do with whether you have developed any of these autoimmune markers. And so we're kind of moving towards trying to be able to detect it sooner and maybe prevent it through a number of mechanisms. It's certainly more common in younger people, but two things. One, it can occur at every age. And I know people who have gotten type 1 diabetes at every age, even up into their 70s. And the second thing is that even if it is more common in its onset in youth, most of the people living with type 1 diabetes are adults, because you age out pretty quickly into adulthood. So all these people have to do something to replace the insulin that they can no longer make. So that's either through injections, or you see here a picture of somebody wearing an insulin pump. There is one that is an inhalable type of insulin, just for short acting for meals. Now, type 2, again, is going to be the majority. There's some other random cases that may be caused by cancer and other things, but these are the two main types. So in this case, there generally seems to be some underlying resistance to how well insulin works. So people may still make a lot of their own insulin, and it's just not enough to overcome that level of resistance. So when it gets to that point where they just can't make enough so that it works effectively, then their blood glucose levels will start to go up. And also what seems to happen with type 2 diabetes over time is that they actually lose some of their ability to make insulin from those beta cells. They're not necessarily destroyed completely like they are in type 1, but they certainly don't make as much as they could otherwise. So this is more common in adults, particularly older adults, but it is becoming more common in younger individuals, which is kind of concerning. So a lot of these people are overweight or obese, but not all of them. Some may or may not take insulin. Insulin used to be something people just didn't want to have to take it because they knew it made them gain weight, or they thought it did. And there's just a high risk of getting low blood glucose and so forth. But there are a lot of other options now of medications that may be used instead of insulin in this population. And then finally, prediabetes. We still have millions of people in Canada who are at very high risk for developing type 2 diabetes. So this doesn't lead to type 1, it leads to type 2, because their blood glucose levels fall into that range that's kind of that nebulous zone. It's higher than normal, but not so high yet that we diagnose it. It's really more of a continuum. And I've seen the numbers change over the decades that I've been in the diabetes world, where you diagnose it has gotten lower, and where you diagnose prediabetes has actually gotten lower. So, but it's a very high risk state, and there's a lot that can be done at this stage too with people working with them in terms of improving their fitness, increasing their regular activity to help prevent it from ever progressing to type 2 diabetes, or in early stages of type 2, maybe being able to reverse that condition. So does it matter if your clients have diabetes? I would say yes, it does actually, because there are so many ways that it can have a negative impact on the items that are listed here. So their overall health, whether they can be active without having any problems while being active, how well they can perform when they're doing activities, how they just feel mentally, emotionally, how they deal with daily life, how stress impacts them, what kind of food choices they make, whether they're likely to get injured. So that's a big issue. And I've recently developed courses for athletic trainers because injuries are more likely in people with diabetes. And even just their motivation, but many more things come up. I think we've reached our first poll.
All right, I'm going to launch a poll. And the question is it possible for athletic individuals to be successful and perform at high, even Olympic levels with diabetes? So I'm going to launch that. So just, you can go into polls and click either true or false. We'll just give that a couple of seconds. Put your answers. Oh, it's climbing, 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 climbing. Awesome. All right, we'll wait a few more seconds.
definitely an interesting question. When I started,
it is an interesting question. Well, what's interesting is everybody said it was true. So Sheri, is everybody true? Is everybody correct?
No, actually, it is true. And this is an old picture here where I have some pictures of some successful athletes with diabetes. It used to be just a few of them, and you could pick and find them, but they were hard to find. Back in 2000, I think I interviewed the first person I knew that was an Olympian with a type 1 diabetes, and that was Gary Hall Jr. here, after he was successful in the 2000 Olympics. But just in the last 20 years, there's been an explosion of people either coming out of the woodwork or it's just becoming more, the tools we have now to manage diabetes are so much more effective than when we had urine testing back when I started with diabetes, and that told you absolutely nothing. So in Canada, you've had a number of Olympic athletes who actually had type 1 diabetes. Chris Jarvis is one, and he is a rower, Olympic rower. There's a guy who's an ultra marathoner, mountain climber that I'm blanking on his name, that lives in Canada and trains in Canada. So yeah, you have them, and so do we all around the world. There are a number of them now, so it's just great to know. But let's talk about how they can be successful and how your clients can be successful at that level, even not at that level. This guy is a picture of him participating in the Senior Olympics at age 96, I think, doing the long jump. And he jumped farther than I probably could when I was 20 years younger than now. And we don't know how you can do that and manage to not hurt yourself. So there's some keys to exercise success that I'm going to spend a little bit of time on today. So I think the primary one is balancing out your blood glucose levels. And that's always going to be important because going too high, too low can impact how well you're doing at any given time. And then just a normal thing, even for athletes without diabetes, is going to be how do you optimize your fuel availability, because how you perform is really dependent on the carbohydrates that you have available in your muscle, in your liver, and whether your body has been trained to use fat for longer endurance events, and what you can really do at any level. So with diabetes, though, the real key is sort of balancing out this glucose level. And these are the technical names. Euglycemia means normal, hypo means low, and hyperglycemia means high. And what it really is a balance between the amount of insulin that you have in your system, especially if you have to give and inject insulin, and how well those 5 hormones that raise glucose are actually working to balance that out. And it has an impact on the liver on how much glucose it releases during exercise, and the muscles on how much they take it up. And what you're hoping for is this top scenario where you can keep everything balanced out so you don't go too low or too high. And in terms of how exercise affects blood glucose, in general, when people do, regardless of the type of diabetes that they have, if they do moderate or more prolonged activity, their blood glucose tends to go down. And I'll talk shortly about why that's the case. But we do use blood glucose as one of our carbohydrate fuels, along with glycogen, as well as fat, and to a small extent, some protein. And any insulin that's circulating around is going to promote the uptake and the use of the blood glucose. And overall, how well you can maintain that, as I've been alluding to, really is going to impact the sports performance of an individual with diabetes. So let's go to our polling question number 2.
All right, poll number 2. Hold it now. Nope, that's the wrong one. My apologies. Okay, technology is really good if you know how to use it. All right, exercise only makes blood glucose go up and never down. So is that true or false? Going to launch the poll. Exercise only makes blood glucose go up and never down. Kind of a tricky question. Okay, the numbers are going fast. All right, I think we're going to call the end of the poll. And so let's share the results. So everybody said it was false. How are we doing, Sheri?
Well, that was easy because I think I just talked about how it goes down. Maybe if I reverse that and I say the opposite, it only goes down and never up, then what would you say? That would be a trickier question. The answer is that it actually can go up and not just down. And that's where it gets a little confusing and a little bit annoying to some people who are trying to manage their blood glucose. So what are some of the things that actually can make it go up instead of down? If you do a really high exercise intensity, such as sprinting or heavy weight lift, you actually might release so much of those glucose raising hormones that they pop blood glucose up. And that can be a problem because if you pop it up because you did a sprint and now you're not doing anything, like Gary Hall Jr. used to always talk about how when he would do his 50-meter swim, which is pretty short, it would only take him about 20 seconds because he was so fast. And then he might start out in a normal range, but then when he was done, his glucose would be 2 or 3 times normal, which is just amazing for that 20-second event having that much of an impact. So when we're talking about Olympic level athlete doing a really high performance thing for a short period of time, but also even if your blood glucose starts out a little bit elevated, depending on whether you're sort of insulin deficient or not, it might actually go up instead of down. That lack of insulin in the body, that's also related to exercise timing, because sometimes exercising in the morning will make it go up instead of down, it's an activity that normally makes it go down if you do it in the afternoon, which can be really confusing. And also if you've recently eaten anything, because while you're doing an activity, you don't necessarily digest all that well. And so you may digest the rest of it at the end when you stop, and then your glucose goes up at the end, even if it was okay before. So what do your clients need to do? They need to monitor their blood glucose, and there are a number of ways to do that now, which is amazing. Like I said, when I started back in the 1970s, there was only urine testing. There weren't even blood glucose meters. So the thing about meters is they only give you a single point in time what you are right then when you measure it, and it doesn't give you an idea of a trend. You're going up or down from there. So where a lot of people have gone now is to use continuous glucose monitors or intermittently scanned glucose monitors like the Freestyle Libre. And what you get is pictures like this where you can see the patterns, the ups and the downs, and where you were the last hour, 2 hours, 12 hours, whether you're trending up or down. And that can be really useful in terms of catching it early before you go too high or too low, or just trying to maintain an optimal range. The only thing about using those is that they're a little bit delayed. They're anywhere from 6 to 20 minutes because you're measuring the glucose in skin rather than the actual blood. And so there's a little bit of a delay, and that can be problematic with exercise. But also what we always manage to follow over time is the average blood glucose. And then I didn't put it on here, but there's a new thing that they've been using for people who are using continuous monitors. It's called time in range, and they actually allow people to track how much time during a day they spend in the ranges that they are aiming for, what would be their optimal ranges. And that can be also useful in trying to track and figure out the effects of different activities and food and sleep and other things that impact it. So what's optimal? I've heard all sorts of different numbers from athletes because it depends on which type of activity they're going to be doing. or how long they're going to be doing it and so forth. But in general, you can see here that most people are going to start out in a fairly normal range and want to stay in that range. And if anything, people might start up a little bit higher just if they know that they're going to continuously drop, or like say they had some insulin recently and that's going to make them drop. But very few of them start out much lower than that, because there's always that chance that it's going to make you go lower, not higher. Now, if you're going to sprint, then you don't have to worry about going low. But if you're doing other activities, you do. So this is a really important slide, and hopefully I made it simple enough for everybody to understand. But we basically have two ways to get the blood glucose out of the bloodstream and into the muscles. So at rest, when we're recovering from exercise, insulin is the primary thing. Now, whether that's injected, inhaled, or it's just naturally produced by your body, it's going to work similarly. And so that allows us to take up and store extra carbohydrates or use carbohydrates in muscle and other tissues that are insulin sensitive, like fat. During exercise, though, the insulin still can have an impact, but muscle contractions themselves will promote the uptake of glucose into those active muscles. And we know from the studies that were done in the late 90s that these are actually separate mechanisms, but they add together. And herein lies the problem if you're an insulin user, why exercise can increase your risk of hypoglycemia or low blood glucose. It's because these are additive effects. So if you have too much insulin in your system when you're exercising, you're going to be at much higher risk for developing a low. So insulin use is really going to have a greater impact than anything else on how well you can balance out those blood glucose levels during exercise. And if your clients start to get hypoglycemia, they may get some of these symptoms you see here. Now, this is kind of a short list. I will tell you from personal experience, there are a lot of other symptoms that you get. And how do you describe impaired vision? Well, mine, if it gets low enough, I start seeing spots in front of my eyes and different things like that. So it really can vary by the person. It also can vary within the person. So by doing a different activity or a different time of day. And what can also be confusing is that the very same symptoms you get from hypoglycemia are the same ones that you get whenever you release adrenaline. Like if you almost get into a car accident and your hands are shaking and your heart is racing. Well, these are all symptoms of a low as well. So it's interesting that our body uses that same flight or fight mechanism in a number of different responses. So we go to try to treat this, particularly when it's related to exercise. It's always a good thing to double check to make sure that that is a true symptom you're having. And you can use a number of things to treat it, but and a lot of people I know still use juice or just regular sugar, but glucose is the fastest thing because you're directly replacing that glucose from the blood that you're missing. And so there are a number of ways you can get that glucose. If you ever buy any products that say they have dextrose in them, dextrose is actually another name for glucose. So you'll find that in most sports drinks and a lot of actually artificially flavored but sugared drinks may often have dextrose as their first one. Smarties candies are made out of dextrose. All the time I use those because they're cheap and easy to carry around. And we also have some other options now too for when people get really tremendously low or they can't self-treat. There actually are glucagon, which is that same hormone I mentioned that's made by the alpha cells of the pancreas. Glucagon can be used to rescue people. And they actually just came out with a nasal spray of glucagon. And it's always good for just people to keep those around to have in case they get one of those really hard to treat lows, or if somebody has to treat them for them because they're not able to self-treat. So here's our last polling question coming up now.
Okay, so low blood glucose is most likely to happen during exercise. True, false, or it depends. So we got a little trick question in there. All right.
I'd be interested to know how many of the people listening have actually personally been able to experience what a low blood glucose feels like.
Well, maybe if you have, put it in the chat. That's awesome.
People without diabetes can actually experience it for a variety of reasons, and it's neat if you haven't done it.
We are going to, oh, somebody said I have a few times. That was Giuliano. I have a few times. And I know he's got there's some questions in the chat. So we know at the end, we've definitely got some questions to answer. Okay. Oh, I've fainted for low blood glucose. So we have some people in there that have had experience. Okay. So we're going to end the polling and I'll share the results. So Dr. Colberg, what is the answer?
You know, I would say it depends is probably the right answer. That usually is a really good answer when you're talking about anything diabetes related and training and effects and predicting your responses and stuff. Well, it depends on this, that, and the other thing. So what we know is that obviously your risk is going to be pretty high during exercise, especially if your insulin levels are high as well. And I put here the things that are ways to prevent that, right? So if you're doing a newer unaccustomed exercise, your body is actually more reliant on carbohydrates than it would be if you've trained and you basically shifted a little bit more towards fat use. And so that's going to increase your risk. And obviously if the insulin's higher, maybe you don't know if the insulin's higher, but if you take insulin and you take mealtime insulin, it's likely going to be higher. But there are other times of the day when it may be higher, even if you release it yourself. And so, if you can do some of these steps to reduce your risk, then you're not going to get low during exercise or after exercise. But both are possible because if you're doing sprint training, you're not likely to get low during the activity at all because you're releasing so many of those glucose raising hormones, but you are very likely to crash later because you used up so much glycogen from your muscles. So that's where it depends. It depends on the type of activity and the duration and the intensity and all sorts of things. So you may also be able to increase your carbohydrate or your food intake to help prevent it. So again, there are ways to do that. It isn't just necessarily carbohydrate, protein, some of it gets digested and turned into glucose and it kicks in later than carbohydrates. There are ways to go about knowing when you may get a low after exercise and doing things to prevent that with these dietary or medication changes. And then interestingly, during exercise, there have been some studies that have looked at using high intensity to try to prevent lows. And they did actually before and after a 10-second sprint, and were able to keep the glucose levels higher during exercise and following exercise. But again, if you use up too much glycogen doing that, then you're going to increase your risk, not reduce it. So I mentioned the delayed onset lows, more likely to occur after you've either done a really long duration of exercise or, as I was saying, doing repeated sort of intense training. Can be as much as 48 hours after, but most studies have shown that it's somewhere in between 6 to 12 hours where it's kind of like a second wave of potential lows comes along. And it depends on how you eat after your training. I mean, are you refueling right away or are you waiting to do that? Because that will impact the insulin sensitivity. And we know that our insulin is working better while we're using our recovery time to replace the muscle glycogen that we used up. So once the glycogen is repleted, then our chances of developing hypoglycemia related to that out of exercise are much lower. And again, there are a lot of things that you can do with your management to try to prevent that. And then one other thing I have to mention that you may not be familiar with is that it's basically you've changed your response. This mostly happens in type 1, but it also can happen in individuals with type 2 where they have hypoglycemia associated autonomic failure. And autonomic, we're referring to the nervous system that is not voluntary. It's the one that regulates our heart and things like that. So if someone has gotten a really bad low blood glucose, then when they go to exercise the next time, they may not release those glucose raising hormones as well. Or if they've exercised before, they may not respond as well to if they have a low later that day or the next day, or even if they exercise again. So prior lows or prior exercise can impact our response the next time we exercise or the next time we get a low. And that's a big problem. It kind of sets people up more for hypoglycemia after exercise. So it really does depend. I'm just quickly going to mention exercising with a high level of glucose. And these are just the recommendations, and they've been this way for 20 years. There haven't been a lot of studies, because who's gonna want to study people with, jack their blood glucose up and then make them go into diabetic ketoacidosis? They don't do that. But anyway, these are clinical recommendations that if your glucose is pretty high and you have a lot of ketones, which, I mean, if you're on a ketotic diet to try to lose weight or something, the ketones don't get up high enough. They don't get up so high as what we're talking about here with hyperglycemia, where you actually can cause a diabetic coma from that. And use caution if it's elevated, but you don't have those ketone levels that are excessive. And sometimes what people can do if their glucose goes up from being active, they can actually do some kind of a cool down that helps them remove some of that excess glucose through that mechanism we were talking about, where insulin and contractions can both do that, as long as you don't bring in those extra glucose raising hormones that are going to raise it. And I put this up here, not because I have time to talk about all these factors impacting it, but just to let you know, in the bottom here, the autonomic associated, autonomic failure, hypoglycemia associated, was what I was just talking about. And there are just so many other things, environmental concerns that we didn't have a chance to get into, other bodily concerns, and so forth. And as I was also mentioning, that the different types of training are going to have a different impact. So if it's short and intense, you don't do it as long, you release more of those glucose raising hormones, and it may actually go up. If you're doing a mixed activity that has a lot of stop and start, hockey practice, hockey game, then it may or may not go up depending on the intensity and how long you do it. And then most aerobic activities tend to lower it. And also just want to mention that the energy systems that we use do have an impact, because the first energy system we have here that only lasts up to about 30 seconds is just using up the energy we have, the direct energy currency, the ATP, that we have to do muscle contractions that's stored in muscle. It's gone pretty quickly. So it'll help you run up a flight of steps, and that's about it. Our glycolysis, our short-term energy, is really what we also call the lactic acid system. And that one will, you know that when you're using it. You do that even when you start any activity that requires you to do much at all, where you start to feel the burning in your muscles. And that's because you're producing lactic acid and other acids in a short period of time. And that isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's just sort of an energy system to get you through if you're going to do something for a longer period of time while that is gearing up. So our aerobic energy system kind of takes over and kicks in between two to 3 minutes after you start. And that can provide fuel energy from all types of fuels. So protein, fat, protein is not preferential, but carbohydrate, fat, and then protein. Whereas the second energy system that gives you the burning sensation and makes you feel like you're going to die before you can do your workout, that one only uses the glycogen that's stored in muscle. So it really does matter. In all activities you're doing that are above just easy standing and walking, carbohydrate is going to be a primary fuel during exercise. If you run out of those stores in the active muscles, the glycogen, then you hit the wall, you bonk, and you're not going to be able to perform well. If your blood glucose gets too low, you're probably not going to be able to perform, and everything just, you end up like this guy lying on the track. I also want to mention that it varies with the intensity, like the actual proportion of carbohydrate and fat use. If you're doing a lower intensity one, there may be slightly more fat that you can use because the intensity is not as high. But for harder exercise, once you get to 65% of your maximal or so, it's all carbohydrate. There isn't really any fat used in those active muscles. And it comes from a combination of both the stored glycogen and blood glucose, depending on what you have available. We don't normally have a lot of glucose in blood. I meant that 100 milligrams per deciliter is about 5.5 millimolar. So only about 5 grams to maintain a normal blood glucose at any one time. So, you know, those glucose tablets have 4 grams each. So you can imagine one of those almost replaces your entire amount of glucose in your system, but it's not going to get you very far. And then recovery in rest is mostly fueled by fat because we're trying to recover those carbohydrates. So I definitely don't have time to get into this, but I do talk about this in some of the courses where competitions may be different than practices. The timing I mentioned, that matters, the training, how well trained you are, the environment, and then even things like female hormones. And then just to talk about some of the other things that come up when you're working with clients. So why aren't they active? Well, with insulin users, one of the primary reasons is actually a fear of developing a low blood glucose. And so in order to avoid that, they just don't exercise at all. This is actually particularly in adults, but I've heard of a lot of athletes, even Olympians, who, when they were first diagnosed, were told they're not going to be able to do their sport. They won't be able to perform. They're going to get hypoglycemic and blah, blah, blah. And so even they had to overcome their fear and manage how to do that and avoid it. Sometimes it's people are just inactive and it's hard to get started. They might have certain health complications related to diabetes or other things that might be a barrier to participation. And maybe that it's just not set up where they don't have somebody to watch their kids, or they're not in a good social support or environment where they can be active whenever they want to. In terms of what people overcome those initial barriers to starting, what causes them to stop. These are the top things that come out over and over again. Perceived lack of time, so ways to get around that, maybe with shorter activities or more intense workouts. Some of them start out at an intensity that's just simply too high. And that leads to all sorts of problems. So you can have exercise-related injuries, which are more common in diabetes anyway, but even more common when you start out at too high of an exercise intensity. And then they're just the whole things that you get demotivated. If you've ever seen shows where they have people do these crazy types of workouts to try to make them lose weight. I mean, imagine trying to do that on your own, staying motivated to do that day after day, and to avoid getting an injury doing that. It's just not going to happen. So let me talk a little bit about the injuries in diabetes and why they are common. So if you think of it as glucose as being a sugar and being sticky, which is kind of works, where it may stick to the collagen and in the collagen, which is part of the cartilage and the joint surfaces. And what it does is it changes those structures so that they're more rigid and less flexible, which leads us to develop more overuse injuries than average, although, anybody can get one, but just even more common in people with diabetes. And then it may be simply related to the people that are working out or starting out with a really heavy weight, a body weight, or they actually have arthritis that may be related to that or aging. And in some cases, it might be related to the actual diabetes medications. There have been some that were insulin sensitizers that actually cause people to get foot fractures. And then there's the use of a lot of medications like statins. In some cases, those have been related to muscle and joint injuries. And many people with diabetes, especially type 2 or even pre-diabetes, are on cholesterol lowering medications that potentially have those sorts of issues. So can these be prevented? Well, I sure hope we can do something about it. So warming up, cooling down, that's important. Starting out at the right intensity, certainly. Slowly progressing and making sure there's adequate rest in between workouts or types of workouts. And then I think the key to all that really is doing cross-training and a variety of activities so that no particular muscle group or joint is overused in a particular way day after day, but where you sort of mix it up a lot with different types. And when you're working with your clients with diabetes or pre-diabetes, then figuring out how quickly they should progress is going to depend on a number of factors you see listed here. But my biggest recommendation is that always err on the side of caution. You don't want to lose them as clients. You don't want them to get injured. You don't want them to get sidelined. starting out slowly, progressing slowly is never a bad idea. I mean, I know they get a little bit frustrated sometimes they're not making more progress, but what you're looking at is the long-term goal rather than the short-term ones here when it's more health related. But, and of course, maybe their goals are just fitness and they're a young person with type 1 diabetes, then you may progress more quickly or more normally. What about burpees, CrossFit, the interval training? Most of these, burpees in particular, are not a great place to start if you're working with older or sedentary clients with diabetes. Now, if you're working with a younger, fit person who may or may not have had diabetes that long, probably not going to be a problem, other than just burpees are not fun. But for these activities, if you, most people who've had diabetes for a while or are older or have been sedentary really should get medical clearance prior to doing participation in really high intensity stuff like that, or if they have any cardiovascular risk factors. And in any case, working with clients to have them establish a foundational fitness first is always a good idea. And then it'd be bad to start them out with something like this and not allowing them to work their way up to it. Introduce it slowly, maybe just 1 day per week. What else did you know? Just basically that just the same as with any athlete, that not every day is going to be the same, both physically or mentally, but particularly with diabetes, because you can have these fluctuations in your blood glucose. Some days you just don't feel as good. Maybe you didn't restore your glycogen as well because your blood glucose wasn't managed as well, or so forth. But just to keep that in mind, have backups, contingency plans, different workouts that can be done on days when people are just not feeling as good, and even adjust during sessions if need, and again, err on the side of caution. And just finally, I'm briefly going to talk about this, is can people exercise with health complications? Yes, there are going to be precautions that they need to take depending on what the actual complication is. I listed the most common ones here, and actually the most common one is peripheral neuropathy, or loss of sensation in the feet, and that can affect things like gait and balance, and whether someone's likely to get injuries on their feet and not know it, and that could be really problematic. So it's best to take precautions, and I do talk about these in my courses too, different things, how to deal with all the complications. So to kind of summarize what I've talked about today, really in order to succeed with exercise, and I have pictures here, these are all athletes that I profiled in the Athlete's Guide to Diabetes, different ages, different levels. The first guy is actually the Canadian who does mountain trekking and other things. You really want to balance out your blood glucose, and that's going to help you maximize your fuels and your recovery from exercise, avoiding both the lows and the highs during and after any type of activity, training, or event, balancing your carbohydrate and your food intake with your insulin doses if you take insulin, and then just taking all those steps that you need to do in order to avoid getting injured in the first place, but treating it effectively if you do. So I actually like to give away information. Most of the stuff I talk about, I put on my websites. One of mine is called diabetesmotion.com, and that has just general information for everybody with diabetes of any type who wants to get more active, and then even more specific information for more serious athletes. Heather mentioned a couple of these before when she was introducing me, but the latest one I have that I did for the American Diabetes Association is called Diabetes and Keeping Fit for Dummies. There's a whole series of For Dummies books, and this one is really good for clients who maybe starting out on the lower end of the fitness scale, or may have been more sedentary, or maybe new to diabetes, and to help them to get more active and stay that way. And then I have the one that's really specific, not that you have to be an insulin user. I have examples from people with type 2 diabetes who don't use insulin in this book as well, but it gets more complicated when you're an insulin user. And so most of the real life examples I have in the whole second half of the book for 165 different activities are what people do for insulin use and how they manage that. So is a really good resource for people who are wanting to be active. And then the courses I've been mentioning that I did actually specific for people working with clients in Canada. So these are the 3 levels. The first level is really just an overview of all the things, a lot more detail than what I talked about today, but it gives you an idea of where I'm going with this, and just talks about how to get clients started and the different concerns that they may have, and talks briefly about special populations, particularly older and sedentary individuals, because those are the ones with type 2 diabetes that you may end up working with. The second level takes it up a notch or 2, where I talk a lot more about food as well, supplements even, gets more into the different types of training, the medication effects, particularly the oral medications, and how to manage all of that. And then the third level really is for advanced, when you're going to work with a lot of different clients, and it talks specifically about athletes and more about type 1 and insulin use, how to manage all of that with sports performance, got a lot of troubleshooting tips, and even gets into a little bit with the gestational diabetes for women who develop diabetes during pregnancy and how to work with them. So if you finish all 3 levels, you'd be prepared to work with anybody with diabetes or pre-diabetes. And so it's actually been bundled together if you want to become a diabetes exercise specialist. And as you can see here, that you actually can get a lot of credits if you need those for your certifications, both through American and Canadian associations. And there's also a petition letter if you don't see the one that you're looking for on there. And those almost always work if you take the course and then petition to get the credits to count towards your specific provider. Also, luckily, we were able to put together a special for this webinar. Since about 33% of Canadians have diabetes or pre-diabetes, you can use this special code, MedeXN 33, to save 1/3 on this courses, either on any level by itself or off the bundle in total, which is already discounted. So it's a great choice if you are interested in learning a lot more. And I'll let Heather talk to you about this.
Okay, I'll just briefly cover this, and then we're gonna go, we've got lots of questions already in our Q&A and chat. So just for the NSFA members, in order to get your free CEC, you need to do the online quiz. So if you have your cameras and you want to take a scan of the code, you can do that, but we will be sending out an email with the link to the online quiz. And once you've passed it with an 80% or better, then you can save the PDF of the certificate that you'll get, and you can send that off to Judy Harvey to get your free CEC. And it's not just for NSFA. So anybody that's registered and wants to participate, do the online quiz, download it. It just says that they've participated in the webinar. So it's something to have, and so you can participate and test your knowledge. Okay, so we're going to go, I must go right to the questions. And we've got a bunch.
Okay, let's have at it. Tell me what they want to know.
Okay, so is the accuracy rates of self-blood glucose monitoring kits fairly high?
Yes, in order for them to be approved for use in Canada or the United States or anywhere else, they have to have a certain range at which the accuracy falls into. Now, I will say from personal experience that I can check my blood glucose 3 times in a row with a meter and get 3 different numbers, but hopefully they don't vary much. I mean, it might be, 5.5, 5.8, and 6.2. So then you just pick the one you like best. But they're considered reasonably accurate enough that you can make regimen changes based on those numbers. Yeah, and it's way more accurate than not knowing what your blood glucose is and trying to make regimen changes.
Okay, we have another one. Can caffeine cause you to go hypoglycemic?
Interesting about caffeine, and I do address that. I think I go into it on the 2nd level of the program because there's a lot of research on that. Actually, caffeine usually has the opposite effect. And most people, caffeine boosts insulin resistance and will actually raise glucose. So a lot of people tell me over the years that if they have a cup of coffee in the morning and they're insulin users and they don't have anything to eat, they have to take a unit of insulin to cover the coffee because of the caffeine. So your response may vary, but in general, caffeine, because it's a stimulant and it releases those glucose raising hormones, it tends to raise glucose rather than lower it.
Okay, I've got a couple more here. So for clients with diabetes type 2 and hypertension that are on a new medication, is it best to have the client wait a week to commence new fitness program to see how their body is adapting to the new medication?
I guess it would only be an issue if their blood pressure is abnormally high and they want to go to exercise. I don't know if they have a way to test it and it's in a reasonable range, then I don't think they need to wait. But if it's still elevated, it's not recommended that people do particularly intense activities if their blood pressure is already high, because you can actually have an exaggerated hypertensive response to intense activities, and it's important not to have that happen. So if they have a way of monitoring their blood pressure and it's reasonable after they start taking the medication, I would not say there's any reason to wait, but otherwise I probably.
Okay, and I just had the question about the caffeine was specific to energy drinks. So energy drinks.
Well, the amount of caffeine in energy drinks is actually pretty significant. I'm thinking. It depends on the drink. I'm thinking of the Monster drinks. Their list, I would say Google to see what the caffeine content is for any particular thing that you're really interested in. But if I'm remembering correctly, the Monster drinks are about 80. A cup of coffee, brewed coffee, can be over 100. So it may not. If you're talking about the little energy shot ones, if it's got like 200 in it, if anything, it's going to raise your glucose. It will not lower it.
Okay, and I guess, but they also have, because they have a lot of sugar in them, correct? Most of them are very high sugar. That's part of it, or some of them, I guess. You have to watch.
I don't know because I don't use caffeine at all. So I did teach that. I taught nutrition for 20 years to my university students, and we talked a lot about caffeine, but I don't know the exact content of those. If most of the thing, I think they're mostly caffeine. I don't think they're like high in sugar, but I'm really not sure.
Yeah, I think some are and some have artificial sweeteners. So I guess it depends.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. And we have a couple of more questions. So in creating an exercise program with a client that's new to exercise, how soon, and they have type 2 diabetes, how soon into the exercise session would you recommend doing a blood glucose check if they have no visual symptoms present or high or low and they're not on CGM?
If they don't use insulin and they don't use any of the medications that are called insulin secretagogues, and again, I talk about those in the overview program and then more extensively in the second level, then they're not likely to get low during any activity. So then I would suggest that they just maybe check before and after to just see how they normally respond to exercise, because sometimes it's motivating if they actually come down from exercise, not to the point of getting low, but to the point of having it in a more optimal range. That can be very motivating. But most of the time, people who are not using insulin or insulin secretagogues do not have to worry about hypoglycemia during exercise.
Right. We did have a question on supplements. So supplements like rhodiola, can they use it?
That one I'm not particularly familiar with. Do you know what it's comprised of?
It's an adaptogen. I'm not sure specifically, so maybe that's something we could.
Yeah, they have them email me. I'll look it up and yeah.
Okay, so
no, not there at the bottom.
Yeah, and we'll provide your email address if they can send a question if they have it. Okay, I'm just looking to see, actually there was one more question came in. So during COVID, in your professional opinion, what's been the biggest concern or problem for those living with diabetes?
Not being able to be normally active. and stress eating.
Right.
I think there actually are studies coming out that's showing that it has had a big impact on fitness and people in general. So remember that if you're starting to work, as people are coming back out of this, that a lot of them are starting out at a lower fitness level. So again, that slow progression is going to be really important to just have them come back from being stuck on the couch in the house, especially when the weather's not been conducive to exercising outdoors.
Right. Okay, so that is all of our questions, and we've come to the end of our time for the webinar. So I just want to thank you so much, Dr. Colberg, for spending the time with us today and giving so much valuable information. And Shelley says thank you as well. And we will be sending out a link to the recording so you can watch it again. And it will also have the link to the online quiz. So whether you're with the NSFA or not, if you want to challenge your memory, you can take the online quiz. So we just want to say, everybody, thank you very much. Really appreciate it. And see you on the next one.
Thanks,
Dr. Colberg. Bye-bye.
Bye.